Hello, my friend. Before we start this amazing episode, I want to invite you to the personal Patreon page of this podcast. If you love what's being done here and want to keep the podcast and the meditations free to the public, then you can come on over to our brand new community on Patreon and donate $11.11 a month, and all proceeds will go towards keeping this free, keeping this going. Plus, we'll be building a community together, and I'll give you bonus material. You can explore this option in the description of this podcast, or just go to patreon.com/Dr. Reese. Let's begin.
Welcome to Inner Peace with Dr. Reese, a program that can help you become liberated in the modern world. Now, here's your host, Dr. Kevin W. Reese.
So what are the gene keys? Welcome to episode number 92. Today, I'm talking to mystic, teacher, and author Richard Rudd, who wrote the famous book, The Gene Keys, as well as The Art of Contemplation. In this very revealing talk, we will explore the concept of the gene keys and the 64 codes of consciousness. We will also go into contemplation and figure out what it is and talk about how to do it and how important it is in your life. We'll also talk about the 7 sacred seals, the law of attraction versus the law of unseen grace, death, and Richard will tell us what happened to him in his late 20s when he had a mystical experience. So sit down, relax, and take in this beautiful recording. Richard Rudd, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kevin. Nice to be here.
So how would you describe the gene keys?
There are lots of different ways of describing it. This morning I described it as a kind of spiritual technology, a technology of transformation, because it has so many access points and it has so many different ways in which you can use it. The most common way in which people will use it is using what's called a profile, your profile, which you get from your date of birth. But it's only one of many ways. So it's a body of wisdom that allows you to go on, multiple journeys of transformation. And as you may know, it's quite a dense body of wisdom. So there's a lot to get to grips to, but there are a lot of different pathways to suit different people and their learning styles. And yeah, essentially it's a means of personal transformation to bring about enhanced states of harmony and consciousness, and to help us, understand who we are, why we're here, and where we're going, individually and as a species.
Yeah, to me, it seems like you've taken Eastern mysticism and you've created a quite brilliant system out of it, a way to find truth, beingness. Is this necessary for Westerners who aren't really into mysticism? They don't understand it, or they're scared of it?
I guess a lot of people, I mean, there's 2 tiers of people, really, aren't there? Not that they're above each other, but there's the group of people who are interested in where they come from and have a sense of, I guess you could say, being more than just a physical body, a spiritual being perhaps. And there are lots of different, obviously, beliefs that people have in that group. But then the other group, I don't know if that's who you're talking about, people who aren't sure or just believe that this is a material universe and that we're here by chance, and adopt the prevailing scientific paradigm. And I'm not sure whether the Gene Keys is so much for those people. because you need a little bit of curiosity to just come in the door. So those who are curious, it's definitely worth a look under the hood. And it's worth, asking someone who's involved in it what the experience has been for them. So yeah, I think it's available for everyone, but it's more targeted for the group, I guess, for that group of people who are already searching, because it allows it, and that's a large group of people on the planet, but it helps quicken their process, and it helps them ultimately, I think, serve the planet in a more powerful way, and perhaps reach some of those others who, because you need a certain language, and you need, as you all know, you need certain credentials to be able to crack the kind of scientific paradigm. And mysticism, although I layer in, certain, kind of scientific truths, and I have a good awareness of those things. I am essentially a poet and a mystic. So I appeal to that other side of our nature, I think, and the teachings are really kind of aimed in that direction. So it's never really been my journey to try and convince people. It's if you're curious in the beginning, then that's a really great start. Then you can begin the journey of transformation right away. So I don't know if that's an answer, but some kind of an answer.
What made you call it the Gene Keys?
Because it's, the essence of Gene Keys is it's based on a code. It's based on a universal code that's, come from the Chinese I Ching originally. So that's where it has that Eastern component you mentioned. And that work, the I Ching, is a kind of binary system that has a real mathematics to it. And, because it's a set of formulas. It's actually a set of algorithms for life. That's really what it is, the algorithms of life itself. And so even though it was discovered thousands of years ago or intuited, and it's been developed by the Chinese, it also exactly matches many other systems you look at. So it has these 64, as you know, probably has these 64-fold structure. And those codes are built out of what are called hexagrams in the original, right, which are kind of archetypes, mathematical archetypes, and that have layers of meaning and can be translated in lots of different ways, practical ways. But the maths of it actually is exactly the same as the maths that runs our genetic code. So that's why, because that's also built out of sixes and triplets and 64 codons. And the same math is inherent in both systems. It's also there in other systems as well, like the musical octaves and the phi ratio, which you find in geometry and in nature. And it's actually the basis of why we're talking to each other right now, because it's 64-bit technology is actually the driving force underlying, our modern computer systems. So it actually is a formula that's embedded at many levels within creation. So that's why I named it the Gene Keys, because they're codes that specifically lead us into our inner world and how we're made up. But it's a poet's view of DNA in a way, and I'm very open about that. It's I'm not claiming to be a pseudoscience or anything like that. It's a journey, and the journey, you've got to take the journey rather than analyze the journey. So you've got to take the journey and then you understand it from inside it. So yeah, that's kind of how it works. You've got to come and try it. You've got to do one of the programs, or you've got to, apply one of the techniques to your life, and then it comes alive. Yeah.
So there's 64 codes of consciousness.
Yeah.
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 Now, there's gene key readings. What does someone get from that gene key reading? You mentioned the profile.
Yeah, there's a profile, and there are people out there doing readings, doing kind of, sessions. I personally don't do that. I've set up, because my feeling behind it is that the real empowerment through any wisdom is if you can grasp it yourself And although it can be a great beginning, it can be a great help at the beginning, because you have someone, a guide, who can like show you how to read the map, which is useful. And but essentially, you can do it yourself. So in the programs I've created online stuff, you actually are taken step by step through layers of understanding once you've got your profile. And you can look at it, and obviously you'll use the main Gene Keys book, which is my big book, which I wrote 20 years ago, or around that, which is kind of like the manual to help understand each key and how you can use and understand your specific keys to enact a transformation in your life. So it's all about a deeper awareness of how you operate, and particularly of the things that cause you pain and suffering. Because that's where it begins. It begins with what I call the shadow. The shadow, which is our the
shadow work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's part of going inside and getting it done, doing the work.
It is.
Are you prepared to be talking about the Gene Keys for like the rest of your life? Because isn't it interesting how somebody puts out a book, it catches on, but it takes so many years. I mean, people are being introduced to Eckhart Tolle for the first time right now. His Power of Now book is what, almost 30 years old? The Four Agreements, Don Miguel Ruiz, these books, they're going decades. This seems like something that's going to go decades and long past your time on Earth.
Yeah, I think it probably will. I had that feeling when I finished the book, and it took a long time to write that book, 7 years or so.
Wow.
And some deep contemplations that led up to it for many years. And I did have that feeling when I finished it, like I'd just written a kind of really great opera or something, and I had that feeling this is going to go way beyond my life. And it's a nice, I guess what's important about it is that to understand is that it's not really about the book at all. That the wisdom is actually, and that's why it's called Gene Keys. And as we said, the wisdom is actually embedded in the physical body, in our nature. So all the stepping stones that I've created, whether they're online programs, the books that I've written, the audios, the meditations, all those journeys, and there are more and more that I'm layering in all the time to appeal to all kinds of different, areas of our lives, whether it's prosperity and money, or whether it's, children and parenting, or dealing with relationships or sexuality, or, I'm exploring the keys in lots of different ways, shamanic ways, and, all kinds of ways. So just all those journeys, they're all pointing in the same way, which is they're pointing you towards the wisdom that's already inside you. So in that sense, it doesn't need me to talk about it. It needs some basic guidance, and then you do the work. Each person that comes to it does the work, and that journey is a journey of contemplation. I call it the art of contemplation. And in many ways, that little book I wrote, I've got it sitting here, actually, as it happens, little book, tiny little thin book, is more important than the actual big thick keys, and that, because we're very impressed, aren't we, by kind of big books that kind of have a lot of layers and depth. But actually the very light Zen book, that one that's much more about the technique and how you can apply it to your life, and it doesn't have jargon, that is like how you do it. And you don't even need the other book, because knowing how to contemplate something is knowing how to unlock the secrets of the universe, because they're all inside us. So there's nothing that the art of contemplation can't kind of handle. There's no problem it can't solve, because the wisdom's in us, and we're saturated with it.
In 2012, I went to an ashram. I was very new seeker.
Yeah.
And I met a mystic. I didn't even know what a mystic was. And he became my mentor for a few years. And one of the things that he told me that always stuck with me, he said, your practice will protect you. And so I just thought of that as you were showing me your contemplation book, because what you're saying is the practice is more important than the fluff around it or the knowledge around it. It's about the practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I sometimes I'd make a joke that, you know, if I had written this little book first, you know, probably no one would have paid any attention to me,
right?
Because it's too simple,
right?
And people are attracted by the deep and the complex, and the, you know, and so the Gene Keys book has its cult following. And yet this is, you know, I wrote this so that my father could understand it, you know,
right,
and he's a skeptic, you know. I wrote this so that anyone could pick it up and take it and use it, and their day would be different for having read it. And you can read it in a day as well, but you might reread it. So yeah, the technique of contemplation is timeless and just hugely powerful and very, very practical. I mean, there's no one that, no matter how, you know, you could bring me the kind of hardest cynic, and I would be able to kind of describe to them how they can get a benefit from this, and if they apply the technique, you know, they'll immediately get a benefit in their life. So, yeah. And they'll probably recognize it as well. That
let's talk about contemplation.
Sure.
You know, it's a term that gets confused by many people. I recently had Dr. Roger Walsh on this podcast, and you know, every time we talked about Eastern traditions, he would refer to it as contemplative traditions or contemplative wisdom. Many people would call it meditative wisdom or meditative traditions, or just Eastern wisdom tradition, or just wisdom traditions. From your viewpoint, can you explain contemplation to someone who doesn't understand, and how is it different from meditation, or what it could be considered a meditation?
Yeah, I mean, I like the term contemplation because in a way it's a broad term. So it can contain many other techniques within it, you know, and meditation can be a technique that is part of the contemplative practice. And meditation is, you know, suited to some people and not suited to others. You know, contemplation is very broad in that sense. So it's about taking an inner journey. I mean, there are very simple principles to it, and it's a very simple basic technique. And I mean, if I describe the technique, perhaps it'll help understand what it's all about. So the technique is it has three layers. The first is called pausing, the second is called pivoting, and the third is called merging. Those are the steps and stages of doing the art of contemplation. And no matter how you're doing it or what tradition you're from, those are principles of any contemplative practice. And the first one is pausing, right? And actually, the other two are hidden within pausing anyway. So all you really need to learn is what is pausing and how do I do it? And it is as simple as it sounds. It means that you kind of inspire yourself, or you allow life to inspire you to pause more often in your life and just be. And there are lots of things you can do in a pause, and that, you know, a pause can be as short as a single breath. It can be a sigh. It can be a pause between saying something and not saying something, you know.
Like, no mind.
Yeah. Or it can be creative. It can be a very, you know, it can be sometimes when you're stressed and then you stop and you remember to pause and you just go, I'm just going to take some breaths. Or you might do a technique. Doesn't matter, but what you do is you're giving some space between you and the pattern that you're in. And that's the essence of contemplation, is to give space between you and the pattern, or you and the current paradigm that you're caught in. And the more you give that space, then the more something magical starts to grow out of that space, those pauses. And I say they can be short. A pause, I mean, even putting your feet up and watching TV is kind of a pause, but it's not truly contemplative.
Yeah, it's a distractive pause,
because
but it's
you're
a pause.
but nonetheless, it's a pause.
It's a single focus.
Yeah, the art of pausing is when you pause from watching TV. So you're like in the middle, you'll just go, I'm going to take, I'm going to take a pause from this, and I'm just going to switch it off. And then you sit in the silence for a bit, and whatever you've been watching, you just let it spin, and you just watch it, and you observe it, and you see how it's affected your mind, your emotions, your feelings. That's a pause. And you can master the art of pausing, and it instantly brings another dimension to your life. And it's so simple. It doesn't require a kind of, meditation can be quite hard for a lot of Western. It's an Eastern technique, and it's quite hard because we've got very trained minds. And actually, one of the better ways to use contemplation is to actually use your mind in a creative way during your contemplation. So you might have a visualization, or you might do something physical. You might place your hands on your body, or particularly one of the things I teach is putting your hands on your belly when you feel under stress, and then just breathing into your hands. And I have a morning kind of contemplative practice that's really beautiful. I usually rise before the sun comes up, and I sit outside, usually with a big wrap around me, and I have little cups of tea, like this beautiful little Chinese teas that I like. And I sit and I drink my tea, and I just listen, and I just dwell there for like half an hour or 3/4 of an hour. And I listen to them. I let the birds come, and I let thoughts come, and I let the night, kind of slough off. And then the day arrives, and it arrives inside me. And it immediately changes the entire structure of your day when you begin a day like that. Because you've begun from a pause. And there are kind of layers of mastery to pausing. Like, one of the simplest things you can do if you have a phone is set your phone to go off every hour, and just ping you to pause. And then whatever you're doing at that moment, you kind of make a pact with yourself. I'm going to pause for like 3 minutes, or even 3 breaths, if you can't manage it. If you're speaking, you stop speaking. If you're driving, maybe you could pull over, but if you're driving, you just breathe. You just take 3 deep breaths, and you just come into like the body for a moment, and you'll see how, you might have been angry, frustrated, impatient, right, whatever. You might have been thinking of 1,000 things, but that moment of pause creates the space for something to happen. And the second stage is called the pivot.
Pivot.
Yeah. And the pivot, if you take 10 pauses in a day, maybe one of them might have a pivot. You can't control when a pivot occurs. A pivot is when you catch a pattern in the middle, and you break it. So it might be that you're in a spin. I mean, I had a guy recently who was a taxi driver, right? I think he was a New York taxi driver, and he found this teaching, and he said, "You've transformed my whole life, because I used to have this really kind of this relationship to red lights that was not positive. I now, every time I come to a red light, I enjoy it. Yeah. It's like, pause. I wonder how long it'll be. Maybe a few seconds, maybe a minute or so.
Yeah.
But in that, you start to change the rhythm of your life.
Right.
And sometimes, as I said, a pivot occurs. So sometimes some kind of a breakthrough or a change or a shift in awareness takes place inside a pause. And that's where the wisdom that we were talking about earlier can emerge from the body. It can emerge from your being, and it might be that in that moment you see something different, completely different. You maybe see a person that you were having a struggle with, or a situation that you were battling. You see it in a new light for the first time. You have some kind of a breakthrough, that's the pivot. The pivot is something shifts inside you, and it shifts spontaneously. You haven't tried to shift it. I mean, you might have focused on the problem, which I often recommend. If you're contemplating, really, there's two ways you could do it. You can contemplate on something that's bothering you, and then it will come to a resolution if you give it time, or you can contemplate on something that inspires you, or someone that inspires you. And then you will kind of go on a journey of uplift, because it will steadily inspire you. And it might also solve some problems along the way, because you'll be kind of raising your consciousness. So I hope I'm giving an idea of the field of contemplation, and there are lots of creative ways to go about it. So in my little book, for example, I kind of give lots of techniques at the back. I say, look, you've got to be playful. So like, one of the ways I learned contemplation, or taught myself, or it taught me, was quite playful. I went to I had some time at that time in my life, and I went to like airports and things for no reason. I went to train stations. I stood in queues that I had no business being in. I went on commuter trains and things, but I wasn't a commuter. And I had several weeks of just exploring, like walking around a supermarket, filling up a trolley, and then emptying it again. And just because I wanted to see what it was like having no agenda, no purpose, other than just playing in those places that sometimes we feel stressed. I mean, airports is a fantastic one.
Yeah.
Because there's so many stress layers in an airport. And once you've kind of, and I'm not suggesting everyone does that, but it's a way of being playful. Like you can play in the contemplative state, and what it does is it changes your whole relationship to those situations. So if you are able to be contemplative in a supermarket, then your journey around the supermarket is kind of mythical. It's wonderful. It's not like you're just trying to get the food and get home. Every step of it is kind of an encounter, and strange things happen. Because you're in a different space, you're more open. So sometimes you meet people that you wouldn't normally have met, and people kind of respond to you differently. And
well, your vibration is increasing if you're if you're very present.
Totally. So you can have a lot of play. You can have a lot of fun within contemplation. Yeah. So let's pause and pivot. Now, shall I just finish with merge? And
Yeah.
It's very simple merge. It's a certain number after you've been doing this technique for a certain amount of time, you will have experienced quite a few of those pivotal moments. And what you don't see until later often is that you're kind of opening up gradually. You're merging with the background consciousness of life. You're merging with something way bigger, with a mystery. And the more you kind of have these pivotal experiences, the more they open up your heart, the more they open up your mind, and the more they relax and soften your body and the processes in your body, your physical body. So it can have incredible health benefits as well, because you're relaxing more and more deeply in your life every day. And every day, even just a little bit, like every day, even just one pause in a day is a victory. It's a little victory. And
even if it's just 5 seconds.
Even if it's 5 seconds. And then, because it'd be like, if you get to the end of the day and you look back and you go, what was my best moment? It's probably that moment where you just went, or, those are the moments when things happen, when magical things happen, these pivots. So eventually you start to open, and then you start to respond differently, because you move to merge with things, and even difficult things, even like aggressive things that come at you, or behavior, or problems, or obstacles. Instead of closing down in a defensive way, you start to kind of move towards them. You start to open up. You start because you're trusting. So you trust anything that comes to you, because your heart starts to kind of go, I can trust this too. This is coming. This is part of the opening. So yeah, ultimately, it's a powerful spiritual path that has been trodden by countless pilgrims, teachers, masters in different ways, and it picks up and puts down any technique that it needs at any point. It can try a technique like meditation, but if you get tense through meditation, you just put it down. You go, that one's not for me, or at least not now.
Right.
And then you try something else. And
right.
so, but it's all within the scope of the contemplative way. So
at the end of the day, I love how you've broken all this down, but at the end of the day, we're trying to watch our thoughts or separate ourselves from our thoughts because we have these patterns. We're pretty much programmed by the time we're 13 years old, at least here in America. I mean,
same everywhere.
And we have these patterns and these thought habits, and a practice like this helps us separate. We're not our thoughts, we're not our body, and we can take a step back and we can actually watch like a movie. Contemplation reminds me of the practice of self-inquiry as well, or vipassana.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like different names for, I mean, they're all maybe slightly different.
Yeah.
But it's all kind of the same thing, isn't it? We're trying to break the programming. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like some of those things like vipassana or it is a form of self-inquiry. They can be a bit more formal, but if they come from a certain lineage. And so they have, tried and tested techniques. This is how you sit, this is how you do it. And that's very useful, if that works for you. So the approach I'm taking is more suited, I think, to the Western mind. It's more, it gives you more freedom of creativity.
Right.
It is more creative. And I think, that's a really important component that's been slightly missing from the Eastern techniques, because they're goal driven, and which is fine. And yet the contemplation I'm sharing, teaching, modeling is not so goal driven. It's more playful. It's more an adventure. It's more an exploration. So the journey itself, like in the supermarket, you're not trying to kind of be enlightened. You're just wanting to explore this life and get more out of it, and be more present. And in one sense, we've inherited this spiritual understanding that's thousands of years old from the East, and it's amazing. And I've explored it deeply, and yet we are moving into a new era, and so there's a shift taking place. And one of my friends, who's a professor of philosophy and religion, he calls it the up and out philosophy. Up and out. The purpose of life is to be enlightened and then leave this plane, right? And I think the next stage of our evolution is to kind of break that down a little bit and go, well, maybe it isn't about leaving. Maybe it's about really being creative and enjoying more and bringing more awareness in, heaven to earth, rather than heaven up there and we're off. I'm escaping samsara into this other heightened space. Right. So I think it's a great challenge. I think it's the spiritual edge of our times.
Yeah. So let's talk about you a little bit. I read that you had an experience in your late 20s. Would you mind sharing that? And was that what jump-started you into all this?
Yeah, kind of. I think it was, it was definitely a jump start. Although I was kind of, when I was younger, I had knowings in me. In my late 20s, I had a spontaneous kind of awakening experience where, funnily enough, I was lying in bed asleep and I woke up into the state. So I woke up out of my sleep and I woke up into awakeness. It was an extraordinary experiences. I hadn't taken any medicine or anything like that. I just woke up into this heightened state of consciousness that lasted 3 days and 3 nights, in which it's difficult to explain, but I was I was filled with light. I was full of light. I was kind of, it was a very physical experience. It's very energetic, very dynamic. Light, literally, the frequency of light was pouring through my body. And that's really where I kind of realized later that DNA itself, the fabric of our being, is actually a kind of transducer of light. It contains light, and it's a wormhole. Every one of those tiny portals that's wrapped into our chemistry that we're built out of is a wormhole through which light can pour. And I mean light as intelligence. Because I understood in that state that light was intelligence. And it's not the light that you see, because you can't see it, but your body sees it. You're in the field of it. The universe is constructed of it. It's the light, the limitless light that sometimes the mystics speak of. And it connects you to all things, and it connects you to timelessness, and you can, you're in a universal mind. So it was kind of fun for me, because I just, whatever I wanted to know, I could know. So I spent 3 days just exploring the universe and going, well, what about that? What about this? Oh yeah. And what about me? Where do I come from? And where am I going? And all these questions, like the young guy asks the old sage, and I was that young kind of.
Well, it's interesting. I had a guest not too long ago named Spencer Clayton, who has had a similar experience. He's in his late 20s right now. And he said it's just a floodgate of information was just being downloaded to him. And he calls it junk DNA.
Yeah, well, in a way, our junk DNA, because it makes up a major part of our genome, and it's not fully understood. It's called non-coding DNA actually now. And they have begun to kind of intuit that there may be patterns to it, but they are much more complex patterns. They're almost like fractal geometries, rather than, so you don't read it in a linear fashion like you read the main part of our genetic code. It's linear. This non-coding DNA may be a kind of, in a language that's a lot more cryptic, that's a lot more mysterious, that's actually a lot more is a lot more efficient, because it's a strange thing to kind of think that with the order that the universe creates, to think that it would just 90% of us would be just wastage, when in fact, that 80-90% may actually contain huge secrets, like the secret of our whole ancestral lineage.
So this 3-day Satori essentially started you on the path.
It kind of, it sort of reset me. I think I was already on the path, but it kind of blew me into another. It kind of blew, in many ways, it blew me off the path actually, because I didn't really know what to do afterwards. And I was, I went through a lot of different states for years. Depression, kind of. I wanted to get back.
Really?
Messiah complex for a while.
Dark night of the soul.
Yeah, lots of kind of, and then denial. It didn't happen. It was just all those sort of things. I tried a lot of different things. Eventually, I kind of started to be human again, and I met my wife. I got married. I started to do human thing. I had a child, and then things started to kind of sing again inside me, and I began to see a way forward. And it began to kind of unravel. I met certain things and people in my life that enabled me to start formulating the gene keys, and like, because I had this wisdom download, but it had no form or structure. And what do you do with that? what are you going to do? You know, what do you do with that?
Right.
So then the structure started to appear over years, you know, and I started to build it. And I have this love of language, and words. So I started to build it out of language and concepts and ideas, and shape this thing that became the Gene Keys. So, yeah.
The I Ching is a big part of the Gene Keys, as you mentioned. Are there any other inspirations that crossed your field when you were younger, that any gurus, any traditions, any books that really helped you keep going?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of my first traditions that I've always been very drawn to was, funnily enough, is the Chinese traditions, the Taoist traditions. So I had Taoist teachers, because when I was around 19, I someone gave me a book by a teacher called Mantak Chia, and it was you may have heard of.
Oh yeah.
And it was a book of meditation, you know, and so I did this meditation in the book, and I had an immediate kind of experience, a kind of awakening, Kundalini awakening experience in my body. And after doing that meditation for literally 5 minutes, my kind of body just exploded. I think it was waiting to happen. And after that, after I did that, I could feel energy I could feel energy, and that's never left me. Feeling energy outside my body and inside my body. And before that, I couldn't. But after that, I suddenly could. So I changed. And I was quite confused by that as well. I was 19. It was sort of, there wasn't a great deal of seeking, you know, then. It was, you know, I guess the kind of 80s and stuff. And anyway, I found this yoga teacher, and I was telling her about, you know, kind of my slightly angsty feeling of like, well, I don't know what to do with this knowing, these feelings that no one understands. And she said, why don't you go and find the teacher who wrote the book? And it hadn't occurred to me. I was like, oh yeah, I could actually.
Did you track down Mantak?
So I went and studied with Mantak Chia in Thailand, and in America. I came to New York, and
Wow.
and I met him, and I it wasn't, you know, he was amazing, but actually it was the people around him were even more amazing. I mean, they were just incredible. They were like Qigong teachers and healers and meditation instructors. I mean, he drew some really powerful, amazing people from all over the world. And so it was suddenly a clan, and I was like this young guy in this clan of elders, and I felt like, oh, finally. And some of them took me under their wing and kind of showed me the ropes, and finally felt like I belonged. And that was a big journey for me. And then it went from there. I also ended up studying under another teacher called Huaching Ni, Master Ni, who has retired to the mountains now, and a wonderful man, very different from Mantak Chia, very, very different. Mantak Chia is a kind of a technique master, you know, and that's why he wrote all those books and kind of revealed all these secret techniques and really pissed off a lot of Chinese people. And Huaching Ni was more of an embodied kind of Buddha, you know, Chinese Buddha. And he taught less through technique and more through presence. And so he was a beautiful man. And so that I was captivated by the Taoist way and the teachings of alchemy, you know, of the internal alchemy, the transmuting of the shadow into its essence, and that kind of tantric path. And so yeah, that was a big influence. Long story, but yeah. And another thing that came my way is called human design. And I should mention that because it was a pivot, it was a kind of real key for me understanding the gene keys. And a man called Ra Uru, who had a revelation in the 80s, and that revelation brought together the I Ching with a kind of new version of the chakras and astrology as well. And it combined all those things that became part of the gene keys, the pillars. But then the gene keys kind of went a little bit in a different direction from human design, and I kind of moved on from that after a while. But it was a real key seminal teaching, and it still has a lot of value to it, and many people know about it now. Yeah.
And recently, your father passed away.
Yeah.
How'd you deal with that?
Well, I think everyone has different kind of ways of grieving and different processes. And he was 94. He did actually die of COVID, but other things as well. And he was 94 and had a good life, and so he had to die of something,
Right.
and he died peacefully at home, and he made he had an impact in the world, and was as a really good moral man, and so letting him go has been quite easy in that respect, and also in some other respect I feel even closer to him now than I ever did, because he had that English gentleman sort of upbringing, and so there was always that slight veneer that kind of, he was very available at some level, but not totally, because of his upbringing, British upbringing. And so now I kind of feel more connected to him than ever, in my heart. And it's a process of, it's more than just, letting my father go as well. It suddenly brought up, more grief around my mother, and who because it's the whole lineage, and so I'm, it's a strange experience. It's still quite fresh in me. So
Yeah.
it's a process. But this last year, my contemplation ongoing has been very deep about death, and I lost another very close friend early in the year, last year, and we had conversations leading up to his death about incarnation and reincarnation and things, and it was we were very kind of, the conversations were amazing, the dialogues, and so I was really exploring this notion of the continuity of consciousness, and became interested in ideas of reincarnation and lineage, and where I've come from and where I'm going, and it was an experience I had in my field of light, that in the timeless domain, I kind of saw past lives and remembered even future lives, and it kind of made a bit of a mockery of time. And so I've carried that ever since, and I'm really interested in what are the mechanisms behind the algorithms, literally behind incarnation itself.
You've seen your Akashic records.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm very much in that contemplation at the moment, and did some great, had some wonderful dialogues this year with Chris Beisch, who's, you'd be a good person to interview him, BACH, and he's written this amazing book called DNA in the Mind of the LSD in the Mind of the Universe, and he's an incredible man, and really a lucid speaker and thinker. And we've done a series of dialogues together on contemplating reincarnation, quite sophisticated actually, and in terms of where we went. They're coming out in the next month or so, and that's been a real eye-opener for me, and a heart opener as well, because it's not something that's talked about so much in spiritual circles. I mean, there's kind of wackier circles, and there's a therapeutic kind of following it has, where it's used in, aggression therapy and things. But a lot of the sort of well-known teachers of the day don't go near it. Which I find interesting. And I like to kind of travel these edges. So I'm finding it a rich field of contemplation, and it's opening up a kind of bigger dimension of understanding time, and also understanding this time that we're in, this epoch that we're in, and the changing epoch that we're moving into. And it kind of loosens a lot of the anxiety that people might feel, understanding a wider view of the process of the unraveling of humanity's higher nature and how it moves through these thresholds of crisis, and how they're not to be feared, but they're to be embraced. And, they needn't create anxiety, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't meet the challenges. We should totally meet them with passion,
Sure.
And yet not be overwhelmed by them. It's not necessary. This is very, very special times like the one we're in now.
Death is a big topic on this podcast. It comes up a lot. And isn't that the job of a mystic, is to sort of get ready to die?
Absolutely.
To be ready to embrace it. You never know. I mean, recently, one of the most famous people in the world, Tiger Woods, major car accident. He was trapped in the car for upwards of 15 minutes before any authorities got there. He wasn't, according to the story, he was not knocked out. So he's laying there stuck in a car. What do? You meditate or contemplate. You that's my thought, and so that's why I wanted to bring that up with your father. And you've explored all of this, so that's why I was wondering how you handled it and how it affected you.
Well, I had this deep revelation last year, which 3 words really. Well, is it 3, 4? Eternity is our home. Those were the words that came to me. My true home is eternity. And that's a sentence that you could contemplate. If you really go into that and you go, what does that, what does that feel like? What does that look like? If I take that in at the deepest level, how might that transform my entire life? And because then you no longer need fear death, because we're eternal. And I often say this to people, I know it. So it needs to be said.
You've seen it, you felt it.
Yeah, it needs to be said. And
being,
we live in a world that's kind of has a very strange, forgetfulness to me, and many others actually. If you dig beneath the surface of many people, they kind of know this truth,
Yeah. Gautama the Buddha called it nothingness.
Yeah.
Put a negative spin on it instead of making it this big, bold, ultimate.
That is the Buddhist spin, and it can be seen as a frightening word, that. And yet, at the center of every galaxy is a black hole. At the center of everything is the unmanifest. So, we move through these periods of, it's the pause. We move into the pause. We move into the unmanifest, and then we suddenly become more alive than ever before. So really, that's what death is. Death is becoming more alive than you could possibly conceive of. Only anyone who's had a near-death experience will tell you this, and there are millions of them.
Yeah, I have them on this podcast all the time.
I bet, and I bet you hear the same things.
Nothingness. Not everyone uses that word, but it's the blackness with a feeling of love.
Yeah.
And this is what Ram Dass kind of coined, loving awareness. So it's a combination of love and awareness, but everyone keeps talking about the color black. It's always a blackness.
Yeah.
Space is black.
Yeah. And we're scared of black,
right.
And so we have to make friends with it. It doesn't mean, it's not that kind of emptiness.
Right.
It's everything. It's the everything. I mean, that's my style as a teacher. I'm an everything teacher rather than a nothing teacher. That's
Right.
why when you look at the Gene Keys, it's like, oh my God, it's like this has got everything in it.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Well, Westerners don't want to hear about the nothingness. It's a bit pessimistic to them.
it can seem that way. Yeah.
What are the 7 sacred seals?
That's a great question. No one usually asks me that question. Well, they're a revelation that came from St. John and from the book of Revelation. That's historically what they are, and they're a very cryptic piece of writing. And anyway, so one of my journeys with the Gene Keys, one of the revelations that kind of unfurled for me was a new understanding of what the 7 seals really are. And so my understanding is that they are portals of grace. They are fields of grace, and they relate to the 7 chakras from the Hindu system. They relate to 7 archangels or 7 bodhisattvas or 7 saints, and so they are, again, universal codes. They relate to the 7 colors, the 7 days of the week, the 7 tones of the octave. All those things are connected to, so they're a universal revelation. And yet my understanding of them is that they unravel in layers, both on an individual level, just as we kind of open up to higher and higher states of consciousness, but they also unravel in layers as a species, the 7 veils that are cast over reality. And as each one is unveiled, or it reveals another layer of what I call the sacred wound. And the sacred wound is the reason for suffering, the higher purpose of suffering. And so for us to kind of gain a full awakening experience, we have to understand, we have to move into the sacred wound. We have to move into the heart of suffering, of our suffering, and not just our suffering, but the world's suffering, the cosmos suffering. And that sounds scary to some people, but it isn't. It's like that black hole. The wider you open your heart, the less scary it becomes, because you just receive more of it, And so the 7 seals are like the layers of grace that heal the layers of the wounding inside us in a sequence. And my understanding through Gene Keys and through teachings called the Golden Path teachings, which are online, a sort of self-study series that unravels, is that our awakening unravels in a sequence. Again, it's algorithms and numbers and sequences, and that's how our DNA works, in sequences, and it unzips in layers, and the heart opens like that as well. So, I mean, for some people, the heart, awakening might be an instant thing. That's fairly rare. But for others, it's a gradual unraveling, as layer upon layer opens, like as I was just explaining at the beginning with contemplation and pivoting and merging. It's a gradual opening up into a deeper revelation. So the 7 seals describe kind of, those universal pivots for the whole of the species, not just individual, but the whole species, and that was a big revelation for me, because I realized that humanity, has these veils over it, but actually we are a collective consciousness, and that, our next phase of evolution will be to start to realize that, and begin modeling it. And that means that everything at even a genetic level will probably change, so we will begin to change, we'll begin to mutate as a species.
Or evolving still.
Yeah, exactly. But in times, like in the past, human species has mutated, and we will mutate again. And so the 7 seals are like part of that journey of like, we're changing,
How do you feel about the law of attraction? It's a very, famous now over the last 10, 15 years. Some people I've heard many mystics say, stay away from that. And other people who really, really put their attention on it and they're trying to manifest whatever it is that they want. What's your approach to that?
It's, I think it's there's a level of truth to it, and there's also a level of illusion to it. I kind of coined a law, didn't coin it, but I just described a law that I feel is more important to know before you even think about the law of attraction, which is the law of unseen grace. And the law of unseen grace says that what you have right now is exactly what you need. And furthermore, the thing that you really don't want is the thing that you need to unpack the most, because it has the most juice in it. And so trying to kind of, the law of attraction is nothing kind of bad about it, but it's like it can distract us from accepting what we have right now. And what we have right now, as I said, like the shadow that we have is actually where we need to really be, the suffering is where we need to really pay our attention.
Not on if we're trying to manifest a new car, or more money, that's, it could be considered greed, which could be considered a quote unquote sin, or the opposite direction of the spiritual path.
Yeah. And there's also, I don't, like one teacher that I really deeply respect, who's not alive and I've never met, Bulgarian teacher called Bain Saduno, who's had a big impact on me. He said that everything has to be paid for. And it was a kind of, it caught my attention in the way he described it. He said, if you attract, a new car, a shiny new car, then somewhere that has to be paid for.
Yes.
And someone has paid for it.
Yes.
And the resources that have gone into it have been, and you now carry that.
Yeah. So this could be where the phrase making a deal with the devil comes from.
Yeah. So I would just caution people to be careful. And it's like, it's great to dream of what you wish. That's like, but the law of unseen grace gives you what you need. And that's, and I mean, one of the things I've understood from, again, through these sequences in the Golden Path teachings, my teachings, is that there are three layers. Again, I like threes. So you have purpose, and then partnership, and then prosperity. And it's in that order. That's the sequence. So first of all, you have to really understand, what is my purpose? Now, and you don't have to understand it like in a mental way. So it's not about going, oh, I'm here to do this. You've got to resonate the beingness of your purpose, and that's a physical feeling in your body. Like it's a sense of being. It's a sense of knowing who I am in my body. And so once you've kind of understood that and you've imbibed that, then partnership is the second one, love. So relationship, the path of relationships, open up to you, and the path of love. And you need purpose first, in a way, in order that you can be clear in a relationship. You don't then get tangled up with someone else's purpose. Like, this is me. This is what I'm here for, and then you can have a clear, clean relationship, and you can progressively then work at that wounding in your heart and open and use the relationships in your life to open your heart more and more and more. And I call that the Venus sequence teachings, which is an incredible set of teachings that were revealed to me as part of the Gene Keys. Doing a retreat right now with many thousands of people online, working through their Venus sequence, which is the sequence that kind of helps you understand the childhood wounding patterns that get in the way of you loving fully, right? So it uses our relationships specifically, whatever they are, parents, children, wives, husbands, whatever, partners, whatever you've got in your life, those relationships it uses. But then the third one is prosperity. And that's what I wanted to come to, is that prosperity really only dawns after the heart has opened. So it's a byproduct of opening the heart. So you can't bypass, and prosperity is also not often what you think it is. Like, it may not be a shiny car. It may be a shiny car, because we're here to play, right? So, but it depends on
play and creation.
Yeah, but it depends. But if it comes to you through, it's got to come to you through the right way. If you try and take a shortcut, and you haven't done the heart work, and you haven't done the shadow work, then you may have an additional burden that you're carrying that that comes back to haunt you. Whereas if it falls from the bough, it's like, if it falls from the bough and you catch it, and it's like, thank you, as opposed to going out and grabbing it and pulling it before it's ripe.
Yeah. My first mentor, the mystic I told you about earlier, I brought this to him, and he said, his exact words is, the beloved takes care of me. The beloved takes care of me. The guy owned a bag, Richard, a bag. He was a wandering mystic. He went from ashram to ashram. There was no greed. And he just said, the beloved takes care of me. I was taught to just do your best. If you just do your best, whether you're washing the dishes or you're at your job, you just do your best. And whatever it is, this universe, it'll just take care of you. Is that similar to the unseen grace?
Totally. It's exactly the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
He said it in a more simple and elegant way than I did.
Do you know that Mike Tyson read the Gene Keys? Have you heard that?
Well, I did hear that. I don't know if he read it or listened to it.
Yeah. Yeah, he said it on the Joe Rogan show.
I did hear that. Yeah.
That's a big plug for you.
Well, maybe. Yeah. I hope it helped him.
Yeah, he's on the spiritual path. You can tell he's very vulnerable and he goes through these mood swings where he cries. This is Mike Tyson crying. You know what I mean? And,
I don't know much about him, but yeah.
And so that's one of the ways I heard about the Gene Keys.
Oh, wow.
And I also have a friend named Cody, who's very huge advocate of the Gene Keys. She does the readings. She's really into it. And I went to her when I booked you for this podcast, and I said, "You got any questions? I'll ask them."
Yeah.
So she came up with two.
Great.
And that is, how can the Gene Keys be used in health and healing of the physical body? Do you see this becoming something?
Well, as I described like earlier, the art of contemplation itself is a cleansing of the physical. It moves us into a phase of healing, because we're slowing down. We're slowing down our kind of our addictive patterns. We're breaking them, and what that does is it breaks strings, you might call them karma, that have been holding back, energy and vitality and light from flowing through our body, from flowing through our subtle body, you might say, from flowing through us. So in that sense, it's a whole body system. It's a healing system, but at a different level from going into symptoms and that's not to say that it couldn't do that, but that's not been my journey with it, and that may be something that emerges more in the times ahead. And I have a dear friend of mine who's a doctor, and he's been talking to me for a long time, saying, "Come on, we got to do something. I want to angle the Gene Keys into healing more and helping to, and so we are contemplating ways of doing that, and I'm sure it will go in that direction in some way. But and many people are using it. Maybe many medics or psychologists and people already using it in their own life. But essentially, I always feel like the ultimate healing is to awaken and to release ourselves from unhealthy patterns, and to do this alchemical transformational work. And then our physical health is a byproduct. And part of our pivoting is to let go. Our body lets go of things. The deepest layers of contemplation are actually in the physical body. So the outermost is mental contemplation. That's where you begin. You begin by thinking about it, this stuff. And then as you think about it more and more, it starts to get into your emotional body, and you begin to feel it at work. It begins to impact your feelings and how you feel, and those shadow patterns and your defenses and things. But the deepest layer is when it hits the physical body, and a pattern is spontaneously released at a genetic level somewhere inside us, or at a neurological level, or at an endocrine level. Right. Something, it opens up pathways inside us that there's no other way we would have reached them. Or there may have been other ways, but it's a very direct way. So and I don't know if that's an answer to Cody.
Yeah. How about fear? Like, for example, what if somebody's having chest pains? It could just be heartburn. It's not a heart attack, but the mind has this pattern of fear, and then once it grabs hold of it, all these horrible visions may come up from someone. How can contemplation and the Gene Keys help someone, switch that?
Well, I teach a really simple technique. I teach it over and over and over again, and it is really the kind of, I learned it from the Taoists, and it's placing the hands on the belly, and
feel the breathing,
taking the breath down to the belly, and if necessary, stroking down to the belly like this, and then bringing the energy down and maybe spiraling very gently. And what you're doing is you're loving yourself out. You're loving yourself into the body, but you're loving yourself through the pattern. You're parenting yourself through the fear. And another thing I sometimes say is fear is safe. To let people know fear is safe. And I know it sounds like a paradox. So if you're in a fear pattern or a shadow pattern, it's deep. It's manifesting through your body. It's in your breath. Your breath shortens, your belly tenses, and so by placing your hands down there and just breathing and just being with yourself in a loving way, as though you're touching the child inside you, you're actually doing one of the deepest pieces of work you could ever do. And it's always in the belly, because that's our core. That's the core of all our tensions, because the navel is in there. That's our little black hole. That's where our life began there. So all the tension that we hold at the deepest level is kind of layered around that navel, and then it comes out, and then it spreads into areas of the body, and it affects organ systems and stuff. So when we do that work, again, we're going right to the source, and it's such a simple, beautiful thing. If you ever feel anxiety, if you feel depression, if you feel any of those things, those are physical things. You bring yourself back into the body, back into the belly. You allow the breath to come
back into reality.
Yeah. So
what's more real than our breathing?
Yeah.
We do it every few seconds.
Exactly. But the touch is also important, touching yourself like that.
I like it. Her other question was, what advice would you give to people who are feeling overwhelmed with the state of our world? It's kind of crazy out there right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
it's been wild in America this last year. I don't know if you heard.
It certainly has. I know. When you can't, I would say pause, at a practical level, learn to pause regularly and do this contemplative thing, because what it does is it opens you up to other realities. It releases the wisdom of the body, and once the body starts to feel safe in the world, then the mind lets go of all the worries that it holds about the future and, you know, why things are the way they are. And your body comes back into trust. You know, it starts to trust. That's why holding of the belly is so key. Like these things I've been saying are like so key. Pausing, holding the belly, just breathing, just being with, you know, creating spaces in your life, being playful in your approach, being very gentle with yourself. You know, what it does is it just begins to kind of chip away at those stress patterns. And then when the body starts to feel safe again, and it takes some time, then the mind isn't spinning. And so you realize that everything that's happening in the universe is happening according to a beautiful kind of pattern. And even the, you know, when the tornado comes and spins and we're caught in it, like we can even trust that, you know, we can even trust the crisis, you know, we can even trust death, because it will deliver us to another truth, to a deeper layer. So coming into that trust in the body is really the best thing that I could suggest for someone, because it's yeah.
It's interesting you said tornado. That's one of the things that gives me anxiety. Those tornado warnings, man.
Well, I tell you, there's a big one coming to the whole planet. You know, in Gene Keys, there's all these names there's lovely names, very pictorial names. And there's these thing called the codon rings, and they describe like groupings of keys that are mystically encoding the destiny of humanity. That's all I say. Like mystery. If you want to know more, you come and study Gene Keys.
Oh my gosh.
And anyway, so those codon rings, they have names, and the one that's kind of triggering all the others right now is the codon ring of the whirlwind. It's called the ring of the whirlwind, and it contains two keys, 55 and 49. And those two keys, 49 is rebirth and 55 is freedom. And so that's what they're doing. But they also contain deep fears, you know, and they're releasing deep fears. The 55 is the victim, and the 49 is reaction, you know, emotional reaction patterns. So those two together, the way they're working, operating through the whole genome of humanity, is releasing us into a new layer of freedom, you know, and cutting through some of these old reactive, violent patterns that are held in our memory, you know, so that we kind of a bridge to a new, you know, so we have to let go into that whirlwind, really. And it's coming, and it's beginning now, really, you know, it's just brewing. And I think it's going to pick up a lot of pace and put us through quite a process. Yeah.
Well, explain this last thing before I let you go. Peace is hidden in conflict.
Yeah. I mean, the same, you know, that's what I say, that you know, every shadow contains a gift. And, you know, in every gene key, there's a shadow, there's a gift, and then there's an essence, a siddhi. I call it a siddhi, a divine, you know, treasure, you know, a kind of a seed of grace. So, you know, when you take the seed and the shadow is the seed, and then if you explore that shadow and you really embrace that shadow, that suffering, and you really get to know it, and then whatever it is, you move through its transformation, then it flowers into a gift. And that flowering goes on and on and on in your life. And as it flowers, one day it even a fruit emerges. So it's a seed, a flower, and a fruit. And the fruit, you know, is peace. You know, like, so if you start with conflict, and then you begin to understand conflict, because it's the sixth gene key, right? This is number 6 in the pantheon. So, you know, conflict is the shadow. It's a universal shadow, you know, and the purpose of conflict is to learn something from it. So as we learn from conflict, what we learn is we learn the art of diplomacy. You know, we learn how to interact with someone in a way that's authentic, that honors them and honors us, honors the higher self in them and honors the higher self in us. And in all our relationships, you know, we then the purpose of conflict then becomes something positive, because it makes us it makes us more empathic. It makes us more human. It makes us more forgiving. It makes us more understanding. It opens us up into this field of learning how to be diplomatic. And that doesn't mean how to kind of, that's not a technique. It means diplomacy at the deepest level. That's a human gift, to know when to say something and when not to say something, to hold it back. Like if you're going to say something mean and you hold that back, that's a good thing, right? Sometimes it's okay to let it out, but like if you have the self-awareness to hold it back from being said, then it won't propagate the conflict. And you might find another way then of saying it, a more diplomatic, a more empowering way.
Right.
So that eventually diplomacy leads, it goes on flowering, and it becomes to the awareness that peace is everything. Peace is every step. Peace has been there all along.
Yeah.
It's like the greatest trick of the gods to hide, or the universe is to hide the highest states of consciousness in suffering.
Right.
So it's like, 'cause the last place where most humans want to look.
Right.
That's why I said, when I began this whole thing with you, I said, you have to be ready for the Gene Keys teachings. Anyone can start with contemplation, but the Gene Keys are a little bit more advanced, because you kind of have to be ready for the shadow work.
Right.
And that takes a bit of courage.
It does.
So once you go into it, it reveals deeper and deeper and deeper layers of grace.
Well said.
Yeah, and ultimately peace.
Well, that's what this podcast is all about. I hope that others will hop on Amazon, go get the Gene Keys and The Art of Contemplation. 2 great books. Richard Rudd, this has been a great conversation. We should do it again, maybe in 9 months, 12 months.
Happy to, Kevin. It's really nice to meet you.
There's more to talk about.
Yeah.
There's always something to talk about.
Yeah. And I love your energy. You're really kind of open, you have a gentleness and an authenticity, and
Thank you.
I really appreciate that.
Thanks.
I'd like to know a bit more about you. So
Okay. Anytime.
Maybe next time we can have a dialogue where you can share a bit more as well.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Inner Peace with Dr. Reese. If this episode opened your heart, feel free to share on social media and tell your loved ones. Also, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, may peace be with you.